It's the Indiana Geeking Podcast with today's feature, Ask the Geek. Yay!
Advanced technology, transporter, beam intruder on the bridge. Wristband control, the crew's knocked out. To the infirmary, life support. Vulcan on the bed, head covered up. He's not dead, Jim. Come on, Bones, what's the mystery? Body survives, but there's no mind. Headed after the lady who abducted Spock. At least she took his brain. Sigma Draconis, a system with three choices, but only one will lead to gain. Beam down to number 6, following our hunch on energy. The natives are annoyed. Destination underground, following a trail. Bones and Spock have joined. Remote control, remote control Spock. Remote control, remote control Spock. You can press a button and you can see him walk. Remote control Spock. Like society, women hide more who have not grown up, and they use them more as their slaves. There's no communicating, must escape and find the controller. The controller is Spock's brain. Remote control Spock. Remote control Spock. You can press a button and you can see him walk. Remote control Spock. The teacher tells us what we need to do when Bones puts it on his head. Oh, knowledge such that Doctor never knew, so Spock won't end up dead. Let's go! Remote control Spock. Remote control Spock. You can press a button and you can see him walk. Remote control Spock. Remote control Spock. Remote control Spock.
Good day, my friends. Welcome back to the Indiana Geeking Podcast. This week we're doing something a little bit different, and that is a feature I call Ask the Geek. I've thrown out there on social media and to my fine patrons, asking people to throw me questions, and I'm going to answer them here on today's podcast. So let's just dive on in. The first question we have is from Patrick Martin, and I quote, "In your opinion, what are the best and worst comics-based movies, sci-fi movies, and movie you want to see made/remade?" Well, Patrick, I'm going to be honest with you. I really don't like calling something the worst. As many of you well know, I do try to be as positive as I can be on the blog and podcast. So referring to something as the worst is kind of, in air quotes, not my brand. But if I had to label anything as such, I would have to label it as movies that I just couldn't even make it through. You know, there are some real stinkers out there. You know, off the top of my head, films like Fantastic Four, the Star Wars prequels, not many people are fans of those. Killer Clowns from Outer Space, I'm sorry, it could be a cult classic, but it is not that great of a movie. You know, Space Jam, you know, just some not high quality films, but you can always find something redeemable out of almost every one of those. But there are two off the top of my head that I have tried about 3 times on each of these films, and I've either fallen asleep, lost interest, and I cannot make it through them. And that is Star Trek Nemesis and the Green Lantern. And you know what's really bad? I can't tell you why I can't make it through them. My brain has completely shut down any and all information from those films. I mean, Star Trek Nemesis, I know there's an extra data type android in there. And the only reason I know this is because when I worked in Hollywood, the studio where I worked were the ones that put together those pieces for Nemesis. So when I went in to archive pieces from Blade 2, I went up to the sculpting mezzanine where those are just laying out on a table, picked up the head of Brent Spiner, looked over at one of the sculptors and went, "Data?" And I'm like, "Yeah, new Star Trek film." I go, "Huh." Put it back down, went back to work. So that's the only reason I know that happens somewhere in the film. And Green Lantern, I just know the jokes from Deadpool. I know Ryan Reynolds was in it. I couldn't tell you anybody else. Patrick, if you're wondering about my best and worst movies, those are the ones I would put out there. And nothing I can really think about seeing made or remade. I don't like remakes. I'm not a fan of those. I mean, sometimes they do them well, but the not so well outweighs the good. And I'm just along for the ride on movies that get made. I couldn't tell you anything I could think of that I've read it and it's like, I need to see this as a film. So Patrick, thank you for your question. Next up is Michael Cathro. Mike, I really hope I pronounced your name right, man. I apologize. This was multiple questions in a single paragraph left on Patreon. So what I'm going to do, is I am going to go ahead and I am going to try to read these in the way it was presented, which in my mind was almost a run-on series of questions. So, "Hi, Tony. I have a few questions. What sort of geek things do you like? What motivated you to start geeking in Indiana? If you're a comics guy, Marvel, DC, Image, or other. If you're a board game guy, what do you think of people calling this the golden age of board games? Why does Monopoly get such a bad rep from people in the hobby? Where's the beef?" Okay, you really don't have to answer that last one. Boy, am I glad I quit smoking. So, you know what? I am game for answering every one of these. So let's go ahead. Let's break them down a little bit slower. So, first off, what sort of geek things do you like? You know, the major things I am really into, I started getting into everything back when my first major fandom other than, you know, as a kid loving Star Wars because it's the 80s. That's what you did. You grew up and you were playing with Star Wars figures. You're playing with G.I. Joe. You're playing with Transformers. The first time I actually started fanboying out and really getting obsessive about something is Star Trek back in 1991, specifically Star Trek The Next Generation. And part of the reason I loved Star Trek and part of how I've gotten into almost everything else I've gotten into over the past 26 years is because of things like the props, the costumes, and the models. I love prop and costume replication. I love model building. That's part of why I really want to get back into this stuff and part of why I'm taking a step back from 5 pieces of content a week on the blog and things like that. So that is what I really sort of the geek things I like. I like things with a great design, things that are entertaining and that entertain me and are also kind of funny that work with that design. And I also like things that are Star Trek is very clean. I really like looking at stuff from Star Wars because it's a little bit worn. It's a little bit dirty. Ghostbusters has fantastic design because it's cobbled together. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the old version or the new version. They both have a cobbled, put together by scientists that are doing this for the first time feel to it. Firefly has some great designs that meld science fiction with Old West. All those are things that I really, really enjoy. Next up is what motivated me to start geeking in Indiana. Well, back in 2010, I was living in Pasadena, California. I was crashing in a friend's spare room. I was walking 8 to 10 miles a day, hitting every place I could think of to look for work. I'm fond of alliteration. I like to say I was pounding the pavement in Pasadena. And as I was doing that, I was starting to come across comic shops, hobby shops, game stores, places like that I hadn't known about, and I wasn't finding information on that easily. So knowing how people, or at least knowing how when I get to a new area, I like to go into the yellow pages or something like that and start looking up local comic shops, places like that. I decided to go ahead and start a blog documenting all these different shops. So that's how Geeking in SoCal started. And this happened over the course of January to May of 2010. Then I moved back home to Indiana. Yes, even though this started in California, I am a native Hoosier. I was born in Newcastle, moved to Shirley, and then I've kind of bounced around between North Manchester, Anderson, Indianapolis, and all around Indianapolis over most of my life. So when I came back out here, I was looking for work again, but out here I knew where things were. So I decided to keep doing what I was doing in Southern California, but bring it to Indiana. And so that's how Geeking in Indiana started. And over the course of the past 7 years, it has grown from just documenting shops to having media reviews, promoting local events. It's gone from shop reviews and almost like a poor man's Yelp to actually, doing what I can to help promote geekdom in the state of Indiana. And we've got this podcast. You've got me starting to try to figure out videos so I can put more than just this podcast up on the YouTube channel. And we're just going to see where it goes. So that is how Geeking in Indiana got started. Next up, if I am a comics guy, do I prefer Marvel, DC, Image, or other? You know what? I'm not a huge comic person. I have no brand loyalty. I am a sucker for licensed work. Books that are based on licenses I'm already familiar with. A great example are the Ghostbuster books by IDW. I love those. I've had Erik Burnham on the podcast in the past. I really like how he writes the voices of the characters. They do some really fun things like the old Ghostbusters meet the new Ghostbusters, the Ghostbusters meet the real Ghostbusters, the Ghostbusters meet the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And then just the standard Ghostbuster stories. They are all a lot of fun, very well written. The art is fantastic. I just enjoy the heck out of those. Other books I really enjoy, a lot of the Star Trek books, also put out by IDW, are fantastic. Really enjoy reading those. The Star Wars books out by Marvel. I haven't kept up with those as much as I keep up with other stuff, but I still enjoy the heck out of those. The Poe Dameron series, I've read the first half dozen issues. Those were very enjoyable. When Star Wars started getting off the ground with Marvel again, really enjoyed those. But other than that, there's not much I read. There is, when you're spending almost all your time writing and now spending time writing and messing with computer programs and trying to build things, I just don't have much time to pick up a book. I am horrible. Let's see. Next up. If you're a board game guy, what do you think of people calling this a golden age of board games? Well, I'll tell you right now, I am definitely not a board game guy. A lot of these games are really complex, and my brain is just not sharp enough to pick up on the rules. However, I can tell you, because of watching everything on social media and listening to a lot of friends who are board gamers, Brad and Amanda from the Board Games with Panda podcast, listening to them talk about games, I can tell you there are a lot of great games out there. And I really think that this is thanks to platforms like Kickstarter and the word of mouth on social media that lets people know there are these really great games that aren't just Monopoly and Scrabble that people can play. And then, that encourages people to also make their own designs that have been rattling around in their heads. Things like, Nightfall Camp Havenwood, which Kickstarter is ending at 9:00 tonight on Friday the 13th. So if you haven't gotten on there, you might still have some time to be able to get and jump on it. But there allows people to make games like that a lot of people will also enjoy, and enables them to get it out to those people. So I think a major part of what is making this the golden age of board games is the fact that people have more exposure to them. You're not just seeing the popular Milton Bradley stuff on shelves at toy stores. You have game stores, you have places like Target they're kind of cutting into the mom and pop friendly local game shop business by putting games that aren't your basic Milton Bradley type games on their shelves. But hopefully it's enabling people to check out those really cool games and then look up places like your friendly local game shop to be able to go and find out what else is out there. That's my hope. I'm not sure it's working out like that, but hey, like I said, positive, try to be an optimist. Now, going from positivity to Monopoly. Why does Monopoly get such a bad rap from people in the hobby? It's a game that destroys friendships and tears apart families. Nobody plays the game by the rules. There are people that are way too cutthroat with it. Their house rules make things confusing. It is just not an enjoyable game. It doesn't matter if you put a skin on it or anything. It is still Monopoly. And with that being said, let's move on. Finally, the last question from Mr. Cathro is, where's the beef? And it used to be at Wendy's, but now I recommend any number of local burger joints. I'm personally looking forward to trying out Kuma down in Fountain Square. And if you follow me on social media, you know that I can really no longer endorse Scotty's Brew House or any of their locations. So thank you for those questions, and we are going to move on to the final questions from Chris Ludden. And Chris asked some really good questions. You might remember Chris from a few episodes ago. He's part of the group that put together Pitched along with Bree and Ginger. And he is the gentleman with the love of Dollhouse. And he has some really good questions, and I didn't write down any notes on these. I'm just going to wing it. The first one he gave me 3. I'm going to skip the first one because it's going to be something, if you've followed me on social media, you know, one of the things I'm looking at is writing a book about the emergence and the explosion of geek culture in the state of Indiana, along with the history of geeks. The Geeking in Indiana, essentially. I want to talk to people who started some of the first conventions. I want to talk to people who owned some of the first comic and hobby shops. And I want to find out, get stories, and start putting together what caused this explosion of geek culture, especially here in the state of Indiana. So that's kind of what his question was. And so I guess I went ahead and did the plug anyway, but this is a book that I'm starting to work on, and I'm going to start lining up interviews for this winter, and we'll see where we go with that. Now, his next question, and I quote, Indiana Geeking does a lot to promote Hoosier artists, and I really appreciate that. Despite yourself and other grassroots efforts, it seems like the general public is mostly unaware that they're surrounded by creative people. I run into comics artists, writers, filmmakers, game designers, and painters all the time. They run the gamut from complete newbie to accomplished professional. Many times they're surprised to find other people doing the same thing they are. Is there something about our local culture that keeps creatives hidden? How can creators do a better job to raise awareness of our collective existence and better connect to one another? This could probably be a podcast or a series of podcasts. And you know what, Chris? I believe you are actually right on that. This is actually the first time I read that question in whole. You know, and this is kind of tough. And like I said, this is why I try to write everything down. I don't just wing it, but I wanted to have a good kind of honest answering session with everybody. And I'm going to be honest with you. I know here in Indiana, and especially here in Indianapolis, everybody tries. You have the indie webcomics group that tries to bring people together. I know Chris is a part of the Indianapolis Illustrators Lunch, where a bunch of local illustrators get together at places like Giacomo and talk about tips and talk about their work and talk about promotion. You have bloggers and podcasters like myself, or Obsessive Viewer just did their Shocktober in Irvington just this past week, where they did showcases for local filmmakers. And I know, not to spill the beans, not to spoil anything, but I know they have some other things that they're looking at doing in the future along with Shocktober, if they can figure out the logistics of it. There are local film festivals. I know the local media likes to grab a hold of any local creators. Fisher's, the Nickel Plate, they do their comic in a day that they promote local artists, but many people are just very focused on what they like. It took me years to start breaking out of just looking at what's in front of me and, just mainly focusing on the fandoms that I was into. And that's probably, Chris, I think you're right that this is probably a whole episode of a podcast or even a series. And so, hey, any of you indie webcomics folks that might be listening to this episode, let's start a discussion. Let's see if we can all get together and start figuring this out and how we can help folks in the community. Like I have time for another podcast, but maybe someone else can help me out with that. So the final thing, and this I know I have some good information on. You have been talking about cutting back on the blog to spend more time on different creative projects. What's drawing you back to these projects? Do you have a favorite project from the past? Do you have plans for which project you'd like to tackle first? All right. First off, what's drawing you back to these projects? Well, as I said earlier, I really miss building stuff. It was difficult to do in an apartment. Now that I'm renting a house, and it doesn't have a great workspace in it, but I have workspace. But now that I have a house, I have the ability to work. Liz and everybody around me is just really supportive of that. They want to build stuff themselves. So that's why I'm getting back into it. I have kits lying around. I've got little Bandai Star Wars model kits. I've got a little bit larger, like the Reliant Project model that I was talking about a few years ago. I need to start picking up the pieces for that, start putting that together. I have a 3D printer that I was able to acquire off my buddy Mike. I need to get that set up and start figuring out how to use it, how to use those models to put together prop and costume pieces. And then that will enable me to start doing stuff like I want to start doing some of the Star Wars costuming again. I was talking with folks here in Star Wars, Indiana, and this is the year, late 2017 going into 2018 is going to be the year that I'm going to complete some Star Wars costumes, and I'm going to get back active with them, doing volunteer work and helping out with events. And so that will lead to the question of skipping over the second question and moving into the third. This is going to be the first project is probably going to end up being something very simple. I dressed as a Rebel Fleet Trooper, those characters from the beginning of A New Hope and the ending of Rogue One, with the long white swooped helmets, the blue shirts, the black vests, the gray or tan pants. I dressed as one of those for Gen Con, and I want to say it was 2005. And as happens over the past 12 years, some of the stuff has kind of fallen apart. I've gotten a little larger, and so things don't fit. Plastic has gotten old, gotten yellow, and so what's going to happen is I've already torn apart the helmet. I'm going to repaint, reassemble, and make the helmet a bit more accurate than it already was. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work with a local costumer who, by the name of Phil, who is putting together costume pieces for members of the Rebel Legion and the 501st. And I'm going to work with him on learning how to sew. But for this, because it's all soft pieces, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to buy the vest and the shirt from him. And then I've modified some pants. I've already got the boots. Check the belt and holster I have. Maybe make a new one. Head over. There's a Tandy Leather here in town. And there's another leather place that I will find their information and put it in the show notes because I cannot remember the name of them because I've never been there. But it's supposed to be a nice leather place downtown. And if I need to make a new belt and holster, I will go through them. And so that way I will at least have one costume done. And then I'm going to start looking into the other things. I need to finish up my A-Wing pilot. I need to put back together an X-Wing pilot. I need to put together a Force Awakens Last Jedi Resistance pilot. And these are going to be a big mixture of purchased items and items I'm going to start making myself. I'm going to learn how to use a 3D printer, how to finish pieces so they look good. I'm going to maybe order some model kits and put those together for things like a blaster. Some pieces I'm just going to buy, like the vests that the pilots use and stuff like that. But I'm also learning how to use a sewing machine. And that's going to be for projects farther down the line when I get some weight lost after I'm done trying to eat all the Twix ice cream bars in the employee cafe. When I'm going to start doing some Star Trek costuming. A lot of this stuff is familiar with anyone who has followed the geek costuming and the costuming bucket list posts that I have done. I enjoy all of the Star Wars or Star Trek costumes for the most part, and I need those, but while I do not begrudge anybody for wearing a costume, me, myself, if I'm wearing a costume like that, I want to look like the actors normally do, not like Scotty in the later films. That's not the costume I want to do. So I need to exercise, get some weight loss before I do that. Now, going back to what my favorite project was. And I'm going to be honest, my favorite project from the past is probably my Ghostbuster. Back in 2002, I helped a friend, me with a couple other people. We took a bunch of resin pieces, bolted them down to a board, filled in the cracks, made a mold of it, and started doing fiberglass proton pack shells. I got one or two of those early shells, and they were when I say early, I mean we're still figuring out how to fiberglass them properly, so there is a lot of patch-up work that needs to be done. And took those, took my time sourcing some of the original pieces that were used for them, put them together, and had a good time with it. Was able to wear it to a convention or two, but I have since lost that. And so one of the things I want to do, maybe with this 3D printer, maybe I'll talk to my friends over at Circle City Ghostbusters. I want to put together, and I want to do that again. That is something I grew up loving. I had one for a while. I've still got pictures. And if I can find some of these pictures, I will include them in the blog post so you guys can see what I'm talking about. But I miss that, and I really want one of those again. Now, it's not high on my priority list. It's not up there with like a lot of the Star Wars costumes I want to do, or the Star Trek pieces, or even the Fallout pieces. If you remember last Halloween of 2016, I was trying to do some tweaking to the Fallout Bethesda store Vault 101 jumpsuit. That's still on the back burner. That's something I want to work on. I just need to improve my sewing skills. So I've got so many things I want to do. I'm not even sure where I'm going to start. It's probably going to end up working on some model kits and just doing maybe some Facebook Lives, some video recording of building some small snap together kits, doing simple washes on them to make them look good. Putting the Geeking in Indiana puppet together, which was something that I've been bouncing around for about a year, and starting to do the videos with that, and then creating stuff on video, and that's what I'm going to end up with. But I need to start small to get myself back in the habit, because I have not done a lot of this stuff since 2006. It has been over 10 years since I've done any serious building. So this is not like riding a bike. This is like falling off a bike. And I need to get back into practice with this. But with that, I am out of questions. So I thank everybody who has sent me a question. I thank everybody who decided to listen in to hear me answer some of these questions. And there's going to be some items from these I'm going to include in the show notes. A link to the Erik Burnham interview, a link to the Chris Ludden interview. And I'm just going to make sure we got some stuff in there that you guys can refer to if you have any questions. And always remember that if you have any questions for me, even if they're not going on a podcast, you can always reach out to me at headgeek@indianageeking.com. And I'm more than happy to help anybody if they have any questions about the blog and about what I'm doing. If I know where to find information on something, I'm more than happy to help people out and answer anything you throw at me, as long as it's not too personal. So with that, we're going to kick in some of the shake-ups in Beach City. We're going to head into the outro, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks, where we will be back with another interview with a local creator. Thank you very much, folks. I'd like to thank everybody for listening to this episode of the Indiana Geeking Podcast. You can find the blog post for this episode, as well as information like Hoosier Convention listings, past podcast episodes, and more at indianageeking.com. If you like what I'm doing, there are ways you can help. First, you can make sure you subscribe through Apple Podcasts, Google Music, Stitcher, or whatever your preferred podcatcher is. Also, if your method allows it, I'd love it if you left me a rating and review. Good or bad, it lets me know how I'm doing. If you'd like to help financially, you can go check out the Support Geeking in Indiana link posted at the side of the blog, where you can learn about how to support Geeking by shopping through Amazon, making a one-time donation, making a monthly donation through Patreon, or even buying Indiana Geeking merchandise through the shop link. Before I go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my $5 and above patrons for supporting the blog and podcast. One of their perks is a shout-out on the cast, and I'm more than happy to give love to Becca, Claire, Kayla, Mal, Michael, Spencer, Tommy, and Tyler for their support. Last but not least, I want to give a huge thanks to the local band's 5-year mission and the Shakeups for the music used in this episode. You can find track info on the blog post and find out more about the bands at 5yearmission.net and theshakeups.net accordingly. Thank you all for listening and for your support. I'll see you next time, and always remember, live long and prosper, may the force be with you, and as always, be excellent to each other.
You're clean, aren't you? Except for your tower. You're a tower junkie, Roland.
Tower Junkies is a podcast devoted to Stephen King and his magnum opus, the Dark Tower series. We discuss the themes, characters, and mythology of the series in Palaver episodes, and review the books and comic series in Keth episodes. We also discuss King novels related to the Dark Tower, non-Tower King novels, TV and film adaptations of King's work, and the latest news about potential Dark Tower-related adaptations. You can find more of our work at TowerJunkiesPod.com and follow us on every level of social media at Tower Junkies Pod.